July 20, 1988, Tehran Radio. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's voice crackled across Iran with words no one expected to hear. Taking this decision is more deadly than drinking from a poisoned chalice. For 8 years, he had promised victory. For 8 years, he had sworn never to stop until Saddam Hussein fell. Now, he was admitting defeat, and the words he chose revealed just how completely the geopolitical chess game had turned against him. This wasn't just a military ceasefire. Behind that single sentence lay months of secret meetings in Tehran, desperate military assessments, American naval strikes, Soviet arms shipments to Iraq worth billions, and a leader who had built his entire authority on refusing to compromise, now forced to swallow the most bitter compromise imaginable. What Khomeini said on July 20th became one of the most famous political statements in modern Middle Eastern history, not because of poetry or rhetoric, but because it captured the exact moment when ideology crashed into the hard mathematics of power. To understand why he chose those specific words, why the metaphor of a poisoned chalice resonated so deeply, requires going back 6 years to the decision that set everything in motion. June 1982. Iranian forces had just driven Iraqi troops completely out of Iranian territory. Baghdad was panicking. Saddam Hussein, facing military collapse, offered immediate peace, a return to pre-war borders, complete Iraqi withdrawal, an acknowledgement that the invasion had failed. Inside Tehran, Iran's leadership gathered for one of the most consequential debates in modern Middle Eastern history. The meeting room was divided. One faction, including President Ali Khamenei, Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi, Foreign Minister Ali Akbar Velayati, and military commanders like General Ali Sayed Shirazi, wanted to accept the ceasefire. Their argument was straightforward. Iran had achieved its objective. Iraqi forces had been expelled. The revolution was safe. Continuing the war meant invading another country and pursuing objectives far beyond simple defense. General Shirazi was particularly insistent. He and other military leaders argued on logistical grounds that invading Iraq would be catastrophically difficult. They stated they would consider resigning if unqualified people continued meddling with military strategy. The army had defended Iran successfully. Offense was a different matter entirely, but a hardline faction led by Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, then Speaker of Parliament and one of the most powerful clerics in the government, convinced Khomeini to continue. Rafsanjani's position was rooted in revolutionary ideology. Accepting peace with Saddam's government in power would betray the Islamic Revolution's core principles. The Revolutionary Guard commanders backed him enthusiastically. They promised they could easily overrun southern Iraq, liberate the Shiite population suffering under Ba'athist rule, topple Saddam's government, and export the Islamic Revolution beyond Iran's borders. They told Khomeini it wouldn't take long, perhaps a year, maybe 2 at most. Southern Iraq's Shiite majority would rise up to support Iranian forces. Saddam's regime would collapse from within. The path to Jerusalem would open through Baghdad. Khomeini, whose entire leadership was built on revolutionary determination and refusal to compromise with tyranny, sided with the hardliners. Khomeini said no to peace. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. What the commanders didn't understand was that rejecting peace and invading Iraq would unite the world's most powerful nations against Iran in ways the defensive phase never had. When Iraq invaded Iran in September 1980, the superpowers maintained relative neutrality. The Soviet Union initially even cut arms supplies to Baghdad, annoyed with Saddam Hussein and hoping to court revolutionary Iran. The United States, still reeling from the 1981 hostage crisis, maintained official distance. As long as Iran was defending itself, neither superpower saw compelling reason to intervene decisively. But everything changed when Iran crossed into Iraqi territory in July 1982. The defensive war that had earned Iran international sympathy transformed into an offensive war of conquest. Suddenly, both the Soviet Union and United States had compelling and remarkably similar reasons to ensure Iran didn't win. The Caucasus of Indiana, Moscow feared revolutionary ideology spreading to Muslim populations in Soviet Central Asia and the Caucasus. With Afghanistan already bleeding Soviet forces in a brutal occupation, the last thing Mikhail Gorbachev's government could afford was another Islamic revolutionary movement on Soviet borders, inspiring resistance. If Khomeini toppled Saddam and installed an Islamic government in Baghdad, would Uzbeks, Kazakhs, Tajiks, and Azerbaijanis in Soviet territory see it as a model? The risk was too great. There was also Cold War prestige at stake. Soviet weapons systems were being tested in combat against American equipment left over from the Shah's era. If Iranian forces equipped with American F-14 fighters and M60 tanks defeated Iraqi forces using Soviet T-72 tanks and MiG fighters, it would damage Moscow's credibility as an arms supplier to the Third World, a critical source of both hard currency revenue and geopolitical influence. The United States feared Iran threatening the oil-rich Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar, that were America's primary allies in the region and guaranteed the stable oil flow that powered the Western economy. If revolutionary Iran conquered Iraq and controlled both countries' oil resources while inspiring Shiite uprisings in neighboring kingdoms, American influence in the region would collapse overnight. The result was unprecedented cooperation between the superpowers. Between 1986 and 1988 alone, the Soviet Union delivered approximately $9 billion worth of weapons to Iraq, more than 2,000 tanks including 800 advanced T-72s, 300 fighter aircraft, almost 300 surface-to-air missiles, and thousands of artillery pieces. France supplied $17 billion worth of arms, China provided $6 billion. Brazil, Egypt, Italy, and dozens of others contributed billions more. The Gulf Arab states, terrified that an Iranian victory would embolden their own Shiite populations to rise against monarchical rule, financed the entire operation through massive loans and credits to Iraq. They were essentially paying the world's arms manufacturers to ensure Iran didn't win. The Reagan administration played the most contradictory and cynical role of all the major powers. Publicly, the United States maintained strict neutrality, claiming it supported neither side in the conflict. Privately, Washington was running two completely contradictory policies simultaneously, and doing so with full knowledge that they directly undermined each other. On one hand, Washington provided Iraq with critical tactical intelligence that proved decisive in Iraqi defensive operations. Satellite imagery showing Iranian troop movements, deployments, and concentrations allowed Iraqi commanders to anticipate Iranian offensives and position forces accordingly. American assessments of Iranian military capabilities helped Iraq identify weaknesses to exploit. Targeting data for Iraqi strikes ensured maximum effectiveness of limited Iraqi air power. Operation Staunch, launched in early 1983, organized a worldwide diplomatic effort to block arms supplies to Iran, cutting off spare parts and missiles precisely when Iran needed them most for offensive operations. On the other hand, and this nearly destroyed Reagan's presidency when exposed in late 1986, National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North were simultaneously arranging secret weapons shipments to Iran through Israeli intermediaries. The Iran-Contra scandal revealed the full extent of Washington's schizophrenic approach. The same administration that was publicly blocking arms to Iran and providing intelligence to Iraq was privately selling Iran TOW anti-tank missiles and Hawk anti-aircraft missiles in exchange for help freeing American hostages held by Iranian-backed militants in Lebanon. The same officials working in the same White House were helping both sides kill each other more efficiently, not out of confusion or bureaucratic dysfunction, but out of calculated cynicism. Washington wanted both countries weakened, the war prolonged indefinitely, and neither country emerging as the dominant regional power. As former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger reportedly quipped with characteristic bluntness, "It's a pity they both can't lose." But by 1987, that delicate balance shifted decisively. Washington recognized that Iraq, heavily indebted and militarily exhausted, posed far less long-term threat to American interests than revolutionary Iran flush with victory. The decision was made to actively confront Iran militarily while continuing to arm Iraq. When Iran attacked oil tankers heading to Kuwait, the United States launched Operation Earnest Will, reflagging Kuwaiti vessels as American ships and escorting them with warships. Then came April 14, 1988. The USS Samuel B. Roberts struck an Iranian mine. 4 days later, American forces launched Operation Praying Mantis, destroying 2 Iranian oil platforms, sinking 3 Iranian warships, and shooting down 2 fighter jets in a single day. The battle eliminated half of Iran's operational surface fleet. It exposed something undeniable. Iran couldn't defend even critical assets against American military power. If the humiliation at sea wasn't devastating enough, what happened on land proved even worse. With Soviet weapons flooding into Iraq, Saddam's military had transformed into an offensive machine Iran couldn't match. In mid-April 1988, Iraqi forces retook the Fars Peninsula, territory Iran had occupied since 1986 at enormous cost. The Iraqis recaptured Fars in approximately 36 hours. 36 hours to reverse what Iran had spent 2 years and tens of thousands of casualties to achieve. Iraqi forces then rolled back other Iranian gains near Basra and in Kurdistan. Iran's Revolutionary Guard commanders were attending a political seminar far from the front lines when the Fars offensive began. The speed of Iraq's victories demonstrated how thoroughly the balance had shifted. Inside Tehran, the political calculations were changing rapidly. The debates during spring and summer 1988 were intense and revealed deep fractures within Iran's leadership. Different factions saw different realities, each interpreting the same military disasters through their own ideological lenses. Revolutionary Guard commanders, who had built their power, prestige, and entire institutional identity on prosecuting the war, resisted admitting failure. They continued proposing ever more ambitious military plans that required weapons Iran couldn't buy, troops Iran couldn't mobilize, and resources Iran didn't have. Their proposals read like fantasy. Seven-fold increases in troop strength, massive acquisitions of tanks and aircraft from countries that had embargoed Iran, even suggestions that Iran would need to develop nuclear weapons to deter American intervention. Rafsanjani, serving as both Speaker of Parliament and acting Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, occupied the critical position between the ideologues and the realists. He was receiving desperate reports from every direction, each painting a picture of unsustainable crisis. Economic ministers told him bluntly that the government could no longer finance the war. The treasury was effectively empty. Military commanders reported that offensive operations were impossible given current force levels, equipment states, and Iraqi defensive superiority. Intelligence assessments showed American naval power completely controlling the Gulf, Soviet weapons flooding into Iraq at rates Iran couldn't match, and international isolation so complete that Iran couldn't purchase even basic military supplies. The political stakes were enormous, and everyone in the leadership understood them. Accepting ceasefire meant admitting that 6 years of war after 1982 had achieved absolutely nothing, that hundreds of thousands of Iranians had died for no strategic gain whatsoever, that the economy had been devastated for no purpose, that families had sacrificed sons and husbands for a cause that ultimately failed. This admission threatened the regime's legitimacy at its core, calling into question whether the revolutionary leadership possessed the wisdom and judgment to govern. But continuing the war meant something potentially catastrophic: military collapse as Iraqi forces advanced into Iranian territory, possible regime overthrow as economic collapse triggered political instability, and the destruction of everything the 1979 revolution had built. The choice wasn't between victory and compromise. It was between accepting defeat now or facing annihilation later. In late June 1988, IRGC Commander Mohsen Rezai wrote a desperate letter to Rafsanjani listing what Iran would need to win. IRGC troops increased sevenfold, tanks multiplied by 2.5, jet fighters by 5K. The letter concluded Iran would need nuclear weapons to deter the Americans. This was fantasy. Iran was under international sanctions. It couldn't buy a single tank. Prime Minister Mousavi had already told Rafsanjani the government could no longer sustain the war financially. On July 2, 1988, Rezai delivered an even more shocking assessment. Achieving victory was impossible, and continued fighting would only generate more casualties without any prospect of success. The commanders who had promised easy victory in 1982 were now describing military impossibility in 1988. On July 15, 1988, Khomeini called together senior military and political leaders for what would become one of the most consequential meetings in modern Iranian history. The gathering included the men who had prosecuted the war for 8 years: Rafsanjani, President Khamenei, Prime Minister Mousavi, Foreign Minister Velayati, Revolutionary Guard commanders, regular army generals, intelligence chiefs, and economic advisors. According to later accounts from Rafsanjani's memoirs and other participants who eventually described the meeting, the military commanders presented their assessments one by one, each painting the same bleak picture from different angles. The Revolutionary Guards reported they couldn't mount offensive operations without massive equipment reinforcement that was unavailable. The regular army described Iraqi military superiority in armor, artillery, and air power that made defensive operations increasingly difficult. Intelligence officers presented assessments showing continued American naval dominance in the Gulf, accelerating Soviet arms shipments to Iraq, and complete international isolation of Iran with no prospect of relief. The economic assessment was perhaps most devastating. Iran's GDP had declined significantly during the war. Per capita income had fallen to 55% of pre-war level. The government was spending up to half its entire budget on military operations, while basic services collapsed. There was simply no money left to continue fighting. Not a single commander believed Iran could win. Not one thought continued fighting offered any prospect except more casualties and possible military defeat that could threaten the regime itself. The unanimous consensus was that Iran faced a choice between accepting ceasefire now from a position of relative strength or being forced to accept far worse terms later after military collapse. But Rafsanjani, who had been a hardliner in 1982, had become the pragmatist in 1988. He understood the mathematics. He saw the economic collapse, the Soviet weapons shipments to Iraq, the American naval dominance. He knew the alternative to ceasefire was regime destruction. Khomeini, faced with this unanimous assessment, made the decision he had resisted for 6 years. 2 days later, on July 17th, Iran sent its formal acceptance letter to the United Nations, but Khomeini didn't make this decision quietly. What he said 3 days later revealed the depth of his bitterness. In his July 20th radio address, Khomeini did not use the language of strategic adjustment. He stated bluntly that he had resisted until convinced by commanders that victory was impossible. He declared that accepting the ceasefire was more deadly than drinking from a poisoned chalice. The metaphor was deliberate. In Persian culture, drinking poison is associated with accepting something that destroys you from within. Khomeini was acknowledging this decision threatened everything the Islamic Republic claimed to represent. He went further. He said those who had achieved martyrdom were fortunate, while he remained alive to witness this outcome. This was a remarkable admission from a leader whose entire authority rested on revolutionary certainty. The statement acknowledged Iran would not topple Saddam Hussein. Iranian forces would not reach Baghdad or Jerusalem. The hundreds of thousands who had died since 1982 would not see the promised victory. Iran was accepting in 1988 from weakness and desperation, essentially what Iraq had offered in 1982 from a position of defeat. The international reaction was swift. The Reagan administration cited the ceasefire as vindication. Defense Secretary Frank Carlucci announced the U.S. Navy would gradually reduce its Gulf fleet. The tone in Washington was triumphant. The policy of supporting Iraq while confronting Iran had worked. The Soviet Union's reaction was more subdued but equally satisfied. Moscow had delivered $9 billion in weapons in just 2 years. The ceasefire meant Iranian revolutionary ideology wouldn't threaten Soviet borders, critical as Afghanistan was already bleeding Soviet forces. The Gulf monarchies had financed Iraq's war effort to prevent an Iranian victory. The ceasefire preserved the regional balance they had paid billions to maintain. But inside Iran, the poisoned chalice created exactly the consequences Khomeini feared. Many Iranians who had supported the war effort for 8 years felt profoundly betrayed. The statement came as a shock. Most Iranians had no idea how badly the military situation had deteriorated because the government controlled all information about the war. State media had continued reporting victories and progress even as Iraqi forces were rolling back Iranian territorial gains. Families who had lost sons, husbands, fathers, and brothers over 8 years of warfare suddenly questioned why those sacrifices had been necessary if the result was simply a return to pre-war borders with nothing gained. The questions being asked in private conversations across Tehran were dangerous to the regime. Why had Khomeini rejected peace in 1982 when Iraq offered essentially the same terms? Why had Iran spent 6 additional years, hundreds of thousands of additional casualties, and complete economic devastation fighting for objectives that proved impossible to achieve? Why had the leadership promised victory was near when they apparently knew it was impossible? The gap between official rhetoric and revealed reality threatened to undermine the entire revolutionary project. The ceasefire itself was implemented chaotically in ways that revealed the disconnect between leadership decisions and ground-level reality. On August 8, the UN Security Council set the official ceasefire date, August 20, 1988, at 3 a.m. But Iranian troops on the front lines, exhausted by 8 years of warfare and desperate for the fighting to end, interpreted Iran's acceptance of Resolution 598 as an immediate ceasefire and began retreating from forward positions. General Hossein Hassani Saadi, commander of the Army's ground forces at the time, later described the chaos. The units stationed on the defense line thought it was a ceasefire and laid down their guns. This premature withdrawal, driven by troops who believed Khomeini's July 20th statement meant peace was immediate rather than scheduled for a month later, allowed Iraqi and MEK forces to make late territorial gains in the final weeks of the war. More Iranians died in late July and August 1988 because of this confusion, casualties that occurred after the decision for peace had been made, but before it was officially implemented. Khomeini responded to the perceived political threat with brutal and immediate efficiency. On July 24th, just 4 days after his poisoned chalice statement, he ordered creation of a special war tribunal tasked specifically with executing military officers deemed responsible for territorial and military losses. This tribunal gave Revolutionary Guard commanders legal authority to eliminate anyone they viewed as having failed in their duties. The message was clear. The regime would not tolerate scapegoating of leadership for the war's failure. He also ordered a massive purge of political prisoners in what became known as the 1988 executions. Special tribunals were established in prisons across Iran to identify prisoners supporting opposition groups, particularly the Mojahedin Khalq, which had fought alongside Iraqi forces. Large numbers were executed in late summer and fall of 1988. The exact scale remains disputed. Estimates range from several hundred to opposition claims of 30,000, though most researchers suggest thousands. Rafsanjani later claimed he saved several Revolutionary Guard commanders from this tribunal, including future senior military leaders. The violence revealed how threatened Khomeini felt by his own admission of failure. For Iraq, the ceasefire came when Iraqi forces had finally achieved military superiority. But Iraq's economy was also devastated. External debt exceeded $80 billion, primarily to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. The ceasefire didn't resolve fundamental disputes. No peace treaty was signed. No reparations were paid. Iraq remained in occupation of some Iranian territory until August 1990. 2 full years later, prisoners of war remained in custody on both sides. On August 14, 1990, just days before invading Kuwait, Saddam Hussein wrote to Rafsanjani announcing Iraq would evacuate Iranian territory and begin exchanging prisoners. The timing was deliberate. Saddam needed to secure his eastern border before attacking south. The massive debts from the Iran-Iraq War, the lack of reparations despite 8 years of fighting, directly contributed to Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. The 1988 ceasefire had resolved nothing except the immediate fighting. The underlying conflicts would continue reshaping Middle Eastern geopolitics for decades. The poison chalice statement became a lasting symbol of the gap between revolutionary rhetoric and strategic reality. The phrase entered Iranian political discourse as shorthand for accepting defeat while abandoning previously non-negotiable positions. In 2012, both President Ahmadinejad and Supreme Leader Khamenei published statements discussing Khomeini's decision. Khamenei, who had declared in 1987 that Iran would never accept the UN resolution, later compared accepting the 2015 nuclear deal to drinking from Khomeini's poison chalice. The memory of 1988's forced concessions continued shaping Iranian strategy decades later. What makes the statement historically significant isn't eloquence, it's honesty. The statement validated something intelligence services had reported, but analysts doubted: that combined military pressure, economic isolation, and sustained arms support for adversaries could force concessions from even a leadership built on religious authority and revolutionary determination. The geopolitical chess game had been played by every major power. The Soviet Union provided nearly half of what Iraq spent. The United States armed Iraq while simultaneously selling weapons to Iran. France, China, and others supplied weapons for profit. The Gulf states financed the war to preserve their survival. Iran lost not because of battlefield incompetence, but because it faced combined opposition from both superpowers, regional states, and international arms suppliers, all united by preventing an Iranian victory. Khomeini died less than a year later, in June 1989. According to Rafsanjani's son, Khomeini desired to step down as supreme leader after accepting the resolution. Rafsanjani attempted to sign the decision and take responsibility himself, but Khomeini refused. The poison chalice was his alone to drink. The statement became his final major pronouncement on the most significant crisis of his leadership, an admission that revolutionary determination could not overcome military and economic reality when those realities became sufficiently unfavorable. In the end, what Khomeini said after admitting he lost the war revealed more than any victory speech ever could. The poison chalice metaphor captured the moment when Iran's revolutionary leadership confronted the consequences of its choices and discovered that the world's most powerful nations, acting in their own cynical interests, could force outcomes that revolutionary ideology insisted were impossible. The war produced no territorial changes, no reparations, no formal peace treaty. Casualty figures remain disputed, but estimates suggest between 500,000 and 1 million deaths, with Iran suffering the majority. The gap between what Khomeini promised in 1982 and what Iran achieved in 1988 measured the cost of ideology unchecked by strategic judgment. Promises to march to Jerusalem through Baghdad, to export the Islamic Revolution, to topple Saddam Hussein, all proved impossible when facing combined superpower opposition. The reality was a forced acceptance of terms that produced nothing except survival. And survival, Khomeini admitted in words that would echo through Iranian politics for decades, was more deadly than drinking from a poison chalice.